No, today I'm going to talk about product management for independent developers. And here is my clicker. So before I get started, I want to just explain a little bit about why I'm here talking about product management. And that involves a little bit of a journey of how I got to where I am today. I've been working with iOS since the very beginning, and as Steve said, I ran a company for about 10 years which delivered training in Objective-C and iOS development and that kind of thing. And as part of that, I started, as Steve said, the newsletter, iOS Dev Weekly. And as with any developer, we are constantly going to try and solve our own problems by writing software. And so I started writing that newsletter with a fairly manual process. I was writing markdown files, and I wrote a couple of little scripts just to turn those into a HTML email, and I'd send them with MailChimp. But eventually I thought, well, maybe I could build myself a tool to automate this process and make it a little easier. And so using the company, we built a product, or actually it wasn't a product originally, it was just a tool for me internally to use to put the newsletter together. But as we were building it, I thought, well, maybe that could turn into a product one day. And so it was always built with like an eye to thinking, well, maybe it would one day turn into a product. And it turns out that it did turn into a product, and that became Curated, which is still running to this day. That's a piece of software that basically puts together newsletters like iOS Dev Weekly. And then as part of that, a company called Litmus, first of all, invested in that company, and then eventually acquired that company. And so I ended up working at Litmus as part of that acquisition in my first ever kind of official role as a product manager. And as I kind of got to grips with that role, it struck me that actually what I've been doing for a lot of my career was actually product management. And that product management, even in a small company, is just something you're probably already doing quite a bit of if you're in that situation where you're an independent developer. So that's how I ended up here talking about product management, basically. So quick question before we get started. How many people here are independent developers? A few? How many would like to be independent developers? A few more. It's very bright lights, I can barely see, but I did definitely notice a few hands going up there. So even if you're not an independent developer today, if you're interested in becoming an independent developer, this information is going to hopefully help you to get there. Because it's really important to not just concentrate on the code when you're an independent developer, as tempting as it is. So let's talk about product management for a second. In a larger company, the role of a product manager is very much in between the development and the marketing teams. So you're probably not going to do very much, if any, development, and you're probably not going to do very much, if any, marketing. But you are sitting there basically as the go-between for those two teams. This isn't a big company. Depending on the size of the company, you might have one product manager, you might have several, you might have teams of them. But generally, this is where the product manager kind of sits. So let's look at an independent developer. What does an independent developer do? Well, an independent developer does lots of different stuff. Everything from the development, of course, to maybe the design or working with a designer. But then also, an independent developer is also responsible for marketing, so putting together press releases, blogging about whatever software it is that you're writing. So you're basically, as an independent developer, you're doing effectively everything. And so part of being that independent developer is also to take care of the marketing as well as the development. And that's what we're going to talk about today, really. We're going to talk about how the product management process can apply to you as an independent developer or a potential independent developer. So what's the first thing you do when you have an idea for an application? Well, the first thing that we all do, there's absolutely no time to waste. The first thing you do is you open Xcode and you start typing code, right? Is that what we do? Yeah? Maybe not. So, and maybe they're being a little bit too harsh there. And instead, maybe what we do is we have our idea, and we say, well, I should see what other people think about this idea before I open Xcode. I realize I've lost half the room already. But if you do decide to think about whether people would want your application, then generally what we tend to do is go to our friends and family and ask them, what do you think of my app idea? The problem with friends and family is that they tend to like you. They don't always like you, but they tend to like you. And the problem with asking people who like you what they think of your idea is that they want to make you happy and they want to say yes. And so you often end up with this coming out of their mouths, while actually what they're thinking is more like this. And this situation is bad in many ways, because really nobody wins in this situation. This is a great way to waste potentially years of your life if you have an idea which is not proven and isn't actually going to be successful. You can plow an enormous amount of time into that and eventually end up with an unsuccessful product, and maybe you have to, maybe it even contributes to the fact that you didn't succeed as an independent developer, and this has happened many times. I want to just make a distinction here between an independent developer and hobby projects or side projects. Independent developer, I'm taking that definition as somebody who makes their living from selling the software that they produce as a developer. Hobbies and side projects are absolutely wonderful, and I'm not saying that you need to do all of this for any of those things. Some hobbies and side projects are beautiful because they don't need to make money, and that's fine, and I'm not trying to say that those shouldn't exist, but I'm saying that if you want to make your business as an independent developer, you need to prove that your idea is actually wanted. You may remember this video from a WWDC keynote. This is only a clip out of a longer video. If you haven't seen this video, I think it was the 2013 WWDC, and it's worth just going and watching it. It's a great little animation. But this phrase kind of became a little bit famous, which is, there are 1,000 no's for every yes. And really what they're talking about there is effectively product management of some kind. You know, the decisions that we make on what to do are rare compared to the decisions we make on what not to do. So for every yes that you make, yes decision that you make, there's probably a significant number of no decisions as well. So, what we're going to talk about today is what I'm calling the virtuous circle of product management. And a virtuous circle obviously is a process that loops around but gets better over time rather than worse. And I want to make the point here of this is not just about your lead up to a first version or a launch of your application. This is absolutely applicable no matter what stage of your business you're at, whether you've got an existing product that's already out there and working and selling, or whether you are just in the process of building that first application. This is going to work for you no matter what it is. So it applies to new features, new versions, or in fact new products. And the circle consists of 4 stages, which is research, the build, feedback, and then finally the marketing. So let's go through those one by one. And a lot of what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to concentrate on a couple of these sections. The first and the third one, which is the research and the feedback. So I want to talk about something called jobs to be done today, which is a framework for user research, basically. So it's been around for a long time now. And it's basically what you'll get out of jobs to be done is you'll try and find, this is a very squeaky stage, I'm sorry. You'll try and find what your potential customers are trying to do rather than what you think the problem is yourself. And we'll go through this. So we need a sample application to work with today. So we all need a new to-do list, right? We're gonna basically use a to-do list as our sample application for today's exploration of this. So the first thing you want to do with jobs to be done is find people who have already solved the problem that you're trying to solve. Now, this is a very unusual thing to do, because your instinct might be, well, if I've had an idea for a product, what I want to do is I want to find people who haven't yet solved that problem, because they might use my product to solve the problem, and therefore they might become my customers. And this part of the phrase here is absolutely the most important. Jobs to be done takes away the sales part of any conversation with a potential user. As soon as you start talking to somebody who has the problem that you're trying to solve, it becomes you trying to pitch your idea onto them. When actually what user research is you listening to the potential customer and finding out what they actually want. So if you find people who already have a to-do list and are very happy with their to-do list and are absolutely the most organized people in the world because they're using this to-do list, that's the perfect person to talk to about what your product might do. Because first of all, you take the sales pitch out of that conversation. It's not you pitching an idea to them, it's you listening to their problem, basically. So that's a really important part of this. There's also another advantage of taking the sales process out of that conversation, which is people are very willing to say they'll buy something, but what they say they'll buy is very different to what they'll actually buy. And by talking to people who have already solved the problem, you talk to somebody who's already made that purchasing decision, and you get the advantage of having that decision to kind of to dig into with real people about the decisions they actually made. The second part of this that might seem a bit tricky is to find people who have solved that problem. So how do you find people who have already solved the problem that you're trying to solve? And the way that you do that is with the screening survey. So you want to put this screening survey together, and we'll go through the questions on this in a second, but then you want to get that screening survey out to people. So if you have social media, you can share it on social media, you can promote it in various different ways, but what you want to do is you want to get outside of that standard kind of circle of your friends, because you want to get those people away from this process. You want to find real people who've had the actual problem that you're trying to solve. So don't be afraid to spend a bit of money on this and promote this survey. Something like a promoted tweet or something like that will get outside of your circle and get people into this screening survey process. So let's have a look at one of these screening surveys. The kind of questions we want to ask here are things like this. First of all, you want to find people who have solved the problem. So the very first question we're going to ask here is, do you use a to-do list? And you're looking for people who are saying yes to this question. You're looking for people who have been using a to-do list for a reasonable amount of time. And so you're not looking for someone who has only just started using a to-do list, because maybe we've all done this, right? We get a new product, and for the first week of it, we're absolutely all in on that, and it's the most important thing in our world. And 3 weeks later, we've actually forgotten it existed, and we actually didn't end up adopting it into our workflow at all. So you don't really want to talk to those people. You want to talk to people who've been doing this for a while. I also like to include some open questions in this screening survey, which is things like, why do you use a to-do list? Make this like a free text question. It almost doesn't matter what people actually write here, but what you're looking for is people who have a story to tell, who have something that they actually want to talk to you about. And so a couple of open questions, it obviously doesn't need to be this specific open question, but having a couple of open questions in there is a good way to get a sense of whether people have a lot to say about this subject or whether they don't really. It's also fine to ask about whether the product that these people are using is free or paid, because that affects the kind of decision that they made. It's also okay to ask how much it was, or how much they pay for it. If they subscribe, is it a subscription? Like you can ask lots of questions in this screening survey, but effectively what you're trying to do here is find people who have a good, solid solution to the problem you're trying to solve. So that's the screening survey. You'll get out of that, hopefully, a list of maybe 5 to 10 people who you are interested in enough to want to interview. And this is where the main part of this process comes in, which is you're going to get these people, ideally, on some kind of call, or maybe even in person, but these days that's unlikely because the internet. But generally, you're going to want to get them on some kind of call, talk to them face to face. And you might be asking, well, these people, by definition, from what I've just said, they're outside of my social circle, so they don't effectively have any actual interest in helping me, and that's important. It's important that they don't. So how am I going to persuade them to spend, let's say, an hour of their time talking to me about a to-do list they use? Well, the power of an Amazon gift card is absolutely incredible. People will do literally anything for an Amazon gift card. Amazon gift cards are better than money, because money has to get used for all sorts of boring stuff like bills and the stuff that we don't really want to spend money on. But Amazon gift cards are pure, like frivolous, free money, basically. So an Amazon gift card is a great way to give people an incentive to spend an hour on the phone with you. You've already taken the steps to find out that these are the right people to talk to. Now what you're doing is effectively paying them for their time to spend an hour on the phone with you. And what you're going to do in that hour is interview them. And there's 3 main things that you're going to want to get out of this interview. What problem were they trying to solve? Why did they make the choice they made? And are they happy with their chosen solution? So you kind of know the problem they were trying to solve because, by definition, it was the problem you're also trying to solve. But people will have a specific story around why they started to use their to-do list. Maybe it was some kind of crisis in their life. Maybe they forgot a birthday card for somebody important in their life, or maybe something bad happened as a result of them not doing a task that they had intended to do. Asking them about that story and letting them tell you that story is going to be really important on knowing how people are thinking at the point where they start looking for a to-do list. And so you're getting a lot of information here about the state of mind that people are in at the point where they're starting to make a purchasing decision about the product that you're intending to build. Then you want to look at why they actually made the choices. So what was it about the application that they picked that made them actually make that purchasing decision and start to use it? The other nice thing that you get out of this part of the interview is that you get to see all the different options that they tried. So maybe they actually downloaded like 4 or 5 to-do list applications, and a couple of them didn't work so well, and then a couple of them maybe did work for them. Maybe they tried one for a week, it didn't work eventually, maybe they switched. This process of that decision that they took is really important so that you can actually think about, well, how is this going to apply to people who are coming into my product? Because presumably you've got some kind of idea that makes your product a little bit unique compared to every other to-do list on the market. Resist the temptation to tell people what your idea is at this point. In fact, it's critical. You've actually put some money into this now. You've paid people with some Amazon gift cards, and so the last thing you want to do here is switch this around into that pitch. So keep your mouth shut and listen to what they actually did rather than what you wish they might do. Let people tell you their story, basically. So the final step of the interview is that you basically get to look into the future. You get to find out not only why they made the decisions, but are they happy with the product that they chose. In order to build a business around software, you need to use software. You need to build software that people are going to use for a long period of time, and people being happy with their solution is a really big part of that. So talk about why they like the solution that they picked in the end. What is it about that piece of software that keeps them using it? So that's the interview. And out of that, you'll come up with a whole load of notes. Actually, just one little tip on taking notes while you're doing these interviews. Don't try and write down your notes or type out your notes as you're actually doing the interview. You want to genuinely and properly listen to the people you're talking to so that you can actually adjust the conversation to go down directions that are prompted by the answers that they give. And if you're trying to type notes as you try and do that, what you're going to do is you're going to concentrate on your notes, and you're not really going to be 100% listening to the people. So record the interviews, get the people's permission, of course, but people are generally okay with being recorded as long as they know they're being recorded, and as long as they know that it's only really for your notes that you're going to be listening back to that. So record the conversations, and then after it's all over, listen back to your interview, and then write your notes. So what you'll end up with at the end of this process is, let's say, 10 conversations worth of notes about people who are happy with their to-do list. The next stage, well, what we did at Litmus is we all physically got in the same room, and we started to try and find patterns in the points that were most prominent in the notes that we'd taken from our calls. And you start to look for patterns in what people are saying. So you're not going to find exactly the same points in all the interviews, but you are going to spot common themes. And what you're looking at here is the common bits of the application that led to the people actually being happy with that software and getting use out of it. So this is jobs to be done, and it's I think it's a fantastic framework for doing this kind of user research. There's more information at this website, which I would encourage you to go and check out if you're interested in the technique. There's actually a really good podcast, which is getting a little bit old now, but the process is the same no matter what. So I'd recommend listening to this one specific podcast episode that's linked from that site. And it takes the example of somebody who's buying a new car, a Porsche, and they have this jobs to be done interview between these two people, but also every now and again they'll skip out of the interview and discuss the interview in the context of what the interviewer was trying to find out at that point. It's a really great episode of this podcast, and it's linked from that site. Of course, this isn't the only research you should do before you start to build your product. You also want to do all the things that you were already thinking about as user research. You want to do competitor analysis, you want to do market research, you want to find out what else is going on in the arena of your product idea. But what I wanted to talk specifically about today was that jobs to be done process and that aspect of user research. So that's not the only thing you should do, but it's part of it. The next step is, of course, to actually then build what it is that your idea was. And by build, I'm not necessarily talking about launching Xcode. I like to think that this talk is basically getting you all to stop launching Xcode, or whatever your IDE of choice is. Maybe this first version of what you actually build is a prototype, and maybe not even a working prototype. Maybe it's a keynote prototype, or maybe it's just some sketches that you want to put in front of people and see what they think about it. So it's not necessarily about building code, although maybe it is. Maybe this is your second time around this, and you're using this part to actually build your first version. However you end up at step 3, you will eventually end up with something to show people so that you can get some feedback. So, who do you show this stuff to? Well, at this point, you don't necessarily want to talk to the people who have already solved the problem, although some of those people may come along with you on this journey, but you want to find different people to actually send this stuff out to, and you want to find those people. Those people are people who have the problem you're trying to solve, because now you are actually pitching your potential solution out to people. So again, what we're going to do is we're going to get some surveys, we're going to find some people, we're going to build a list of potential beta testers or people that we can show our prototype to. We're going to interview them about what they think about what we've produced. And try not to be too fixed in your ideas here. This circle of product management works best when you haven't put a year's worth of your life into that first version. So I would really encourage you to do this quite fast and get early feedback about, like, definitely don't build your software as stage 1. Get some feedback on your designs so that you can be a little bit flexible in what you hear, in taking the feedback that you hear and actually adjusting what you're going to do based on that feedback. The other thing that's really important here is to include analytics in your early versions. Now, obviously, with a Keynote prototype or something like that, it's difficult to put analytics in. But when you get to the point of actually writing software, which you will at some point, having analytics even in your beta software, I believe is really, really important. Because, again, what people say they do and what people actually do is quite often different. So there was a good example of this when I was working at Litmus, and we built this product. So we did the research, we built a version of this feature, and we sent this version of this feature out to a small group of beta testers who were already Litmus customers and who were interested in this potential feature that we'd built. And part of the feature that we built was the ability for people within the teams of customers to approve something that was in the application. And so we built this approvals feature, and I then interviewed people about what they thought of it, and with a survey, with a questionnaire. And the very first question on that questionnaire was, did you use the approvals feature? And most people said yes, which was good. So I looked at the analytics that we put in, and not a single person had clicked on the approvals feature. And actually, so you might think, well, why were people lying about it? Well, actually, they weren't lying about it. What they'd done is they had a job to do. Their job was to approve something using our software. They hadn't found the approvals feature. We'd hidden it too well, and they just hadn't found the UI for it at all. So what they were doing was they were using other features of the software. One of the features of this software was that you could add a comment. And what they were doing was they were clicking to add a comment and typing the word approved and hitting submit. And so were they using the approvals feature? Absolutely. They were approving whatever it was that needed approving using our software. But they weren't using our actual feature that we'd built. So we tweaked it a little bit, we made the UI a little bit more prominent, and then sure enough, people actually started using it for approvals. But that was really a very eye-opening moment of what people say they do and what people actually do. And having analytics that absolutely don't lie about what people did with your software is a great way to get that out. So at this point, you want to also make a plan for your feedback. You want to maybe check your analytics, obviously, all the time, but you also want to maybe just drop people a personal email. People can tell a personal email from an email that's sent to many, many people very easily. We have something within our brains that's absolutely tuned into the fact that this is an email that was written to you specifically. You're only dealing with a small number of people at this point, so you can take the time to just write them a personal email and see what they think of it. And you're much more likely to get a response back to that personal email than you are to something else. Maybe after a couple of weeks, you want to also back that up with a survey so that you can actually take some aggregate data across the beta test. And then actually, again, get people on the phone and talk to them about what they liked and didn't like about your software. The final stage of the virtuous circle is to actually then put all of that research and feedback into a marketing plan so that you can take it out of beta and into the wider world and start selling your product. So before we talk about the specifics of this, let's talk for a second about what marketing is. So marketing is many, many things. Maybe it's writing blog posts, maybe it's writing press releases, maybe it's promoting it to on your website, maybe it's promoting it in interviews. Lots of different ways to get the word out about your product, but all of them have one thing in common, which is marketing is talking about what you're doing or what you've done. And the most effective form of communication is storytelling. We've been tuned to listen to stories for our entire lives. You know, from being children, we spend an enormous amount of time telling and listening to stories. And the best thing about this idea is that the first part of this process was you listening to people's stories about the problems that they had and why they needed to find a solution to those problems. And so you've actually got a huge number of potential stories that you can use as the storytelling mechanism to sell your software. And so what you want to do is you want to not use the exact stories that you heard, of course, but you want to get the common bits of the stories that you heard that made you just make the decisions on what features to add to your application. And you want to tell those in a compelling way by actually telling the story of what problem does this solve to your users. Focus the stories on specifics as well. So don't be afraid to write several different stories that apply to different segments of your potential market. Depending on the stories that you heard, and I'm not going to give specific examples here because it will be different for every single application, but you will have heard different stories from different people coming into that process. And so don't be afraid to write a few different versions of the story that you're telling back about your product. And so this really, I think, makes a beautiful way to think about this whole circle, which is you're basically listening to people's stories as user research. You're taking those stories and you're formulating them into a product which hopefully helps people that have the problems that you were talking about. And then you're effectively telling those same stories back in a different form as your marketing. And I think that makes a lovely kind of circular process of hopefully building a successful product. So here we are back at this first slide of the product manager sitting right in between product development and product marketing. And as an independent developer, you're going to be doing both of those jobs. But what I want to say here is that this stuff takes time. And you might think that the best time that you can spend on your product is making the product better. That is the if I dare to say it, the trap that we fall into of how we can best spend our time to make our product more successful. Our brain naturally falls to, well, I should make the product better, because if I have a better product, people will like it more, people will tell their friends about it, people will buy it. But actually, it's just as important. I mean, you need to have a good product. You can't make a successful product out of a bad product, but your product doesn't need to be as good as you probably think it needs to be. It needs to be great, but not at the expense of letting marketing suffer. And so I would say that you need to spend, I would say, 50% of your time on this kind of task. So everything that isn't writing the code, on the user research, on the marketing. which is, it's a lot of time, and it's a lot of money that you're going to basically put into that process. So you might be thinking, well, can I actually afford to do that? And actually, I think the answer to that is the other way around, and it's actually, can I afford not to do this? This is so important because if you don't do this, it's much less likely that your product will be successful and that you'll be able to become or continue in that role as an independent developer. So here's our circle. The other thing that's important here is that you might have several of these circles going on at the same time. Obviously, when you're doing that user research in the feedback section, there's going to be large periods of time where people are just taking those surveys and filling them in, and you might have a week or two of kind of slack time. And so you don't just want to sit there doing nothing, of course. What you want to do is you want to potentially be running several of these processes in parallel. So maybe at one point, some surveys are out for some feedback on a new feature that you're thinking about adding, whereas you're also building a feature that was previously proven. And so you might be doing this multiple times in parallel. And of course, if you are being successful with your products, which hopefully you are, maybe this isn't all you. Maybe at this point, this is more than one person, and this is how you build your business into something that is more successful and maybe has more people involved in that process of building it. So you'll build better features. You'll build a base of people who absolutely, genuinely love your product because the product is solving the problems that they actually had rather than the problems that you think they might have had. And this is why you should care about product management as an independent developer. So thank you very much for listening this morning, and if there's any questions, I'd love to take them.
Does anyone have any questions for Tony?
One over there.
Thanks, really enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you.
I just wondered if you had anything to say about the best ways to find out what might make the product you've got in mind different. So I was making notes and listening to what you were saying. I could imagine the situation where you end up finding out a lot of detail about what features are already great in the products that are already out there, and maybe not so much on what's missing. So what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so presumably, and I have kind of focused this talk on independent developers, and a lot of software that comes out of independent developers is scratching the itch that the developer originally had. So presumably there was something in that problem that you were trying to solve originally that made it different from all of the other solutions. Like there are a million to-do lists already out there. I'm probably not going to build a to-do list because there's almost certainly one that solves exactly the problem I have. So presumably there'll be some kind of seed of something unique about your potential idea, which was why you started this whole process in the first place, that makes it different from some of the other aspects. But then the important thing is to then prove that it's not just you that has the need for that unique bit, and kind of prove the market, basically, prove that other people need that unique thing. So I'm not sure I can give you advice on how to come up with the unique thing. That probably comes out of the idea. And the idea is something that you will have had, obviously ideas are infinite, right? So the idea will probably have something unique in it, otherwise you would have just gone and found a solution yourself. But then the key bit of this strategy is to make sure that what you thought was the unique selling point of this is actually the unique selling point of it, and to prove that.
I've got a question actually, Dave. So one of the problems I think we find as developers, certainly in the ecospace currently, is that there are so many apps in the App Store, it's very, very difficult to differentiate yourself. So what advice would you give to somebody in terms of how they can differentiate themselves in their app so that they get noticed in the App Store, given the fact there's now however many hundreds of thousands of apps?
Yeah. So the story of I wrote an app is no longer newsworthy. You need something more than just the fact that you've released an app to get people's attention. There's a couple of things here that I'll talk about. First is having a base of people who actually use and enjoy and get value out of your application is a very powerful way to spread the word about your application. And the nice thing about this process is that you're building that group of people from the very beginning of the process. You're building people who, building a list of people who have the problem that you are potentially trying to solve and have been helping you produce the solution to it. And so you've got that. Hopefully, by the end of the process, if you're building something that they genuinely do want, you'll have a group of people who are going to be kind of ambassadors for your product. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, it's okay to do kind of traditional marketing, like reach out to blogs and publications that you actually want to cover your application. And don't always look for the publications and blogs that are talking about apps that get released. What you want to do is you want to find the places that people are talking about the problem that you're trying to solve. The fact that it's an app almost isn't important. What you're selling is a solution to a problem. And so if you're, let's take the example of the to-do list. If you're building that to-do list, you want to look for marketing opportunities in places where people are talking about productivity and getting things done and organization and that kind of stuff. So it's not always about going to where you might initially think, which is, okay, well, I need to get on Mac Stories or I need to get on TechCrunch or something like that. It's not necessarily about that. It's about solving the real problem, which is then going to put your application in front of people who have that problem as well.
Perfect. Any final questions? Okay, so let's thank Dave. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, everybody.